Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. It's Monday, June 10th, 2019. If we'd all please rise for our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And at this point in time, I'd like to introduce the members of the commission as well as staff that are here this evening. To my far right is Jeff Cohan, who is a commission member. To my immediate right is James Fitzsimmons, also a commission member. At the far end of the table is Steve Allenson, who's an alternate on the commission. To the right of Steve is Rocco Matarazzo, who is a commissioner. And to my immediate left is J.P. Benoit, who is the vice chairperson of the commission. I'd also like to mention that Mr. Matarazzo is our secretary. At the staff table to the left is Cynthia Kleist, who is our recording secretary. And next to Cynthia is Casey Han, our town planner. Our next order of business is to approve the minutes of our May 13th, 2019 meeting. Do I have any commissioner that would like to make a motion on the minutes or make any corrections, additions, adjustments to the minutes before we look to approve them?
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the minutes of Monday, May 13, 2019 minutes.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Fitzsimmons. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Moving on to our agenda. Our first item on our agenda is a public hearing. It's for a special permit for SAI Group for Electrify America at 844 North Colony Road, Walmart. That application has been withdrawn by the applicant, so obviously it will not be heard this evening. Which brings us to our next item on our agenda, a zoning text amendment by the Planning and Zoning Commission to section 4.6.D.10, 4.8C, 11, 4.16C.1.H, 4.22.D2, clarification, modification of these sections of the zoning regulations pertaining to electric vehicles charging stations. Mr. Matarazzo, if you please read the legal notice as well as note all correspondence for the record.
Mr. Chairman, we have a legal notice 902-19, zoning text amendment to sections 4.6.D.10, 4.8.C.11, 4.16.C.1.H, and 4.22.D.2 to clarify the allowance of charging stations for electric vehicles as a primary use by special permit by clarifying/modifying the current category of gasoline service stations. Also to clarify the application of this category for car washes, detailing, oil change facilities, and other similar uses. We have interdepartmental referral regarding application 902-19, dated May 7, 2019, signed by the fire marshal, and proposed modification correspondence referencing sections 4.6.D.10, 4.8.C.11, 4.16.C.1.H, and 4.22.D.2 to read as, well, we know what, you want to read this whole thing? No. That's it.
Let's see.
Oh, I forgot one. What do we call this?
That's a section from the Plan of Conservation and Development, page 7.
Gotcha.
Sorry,
Okay.
I should have put that title at the top.
That's okay. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Matarazzo. And Mrs. Han, this is a text amendment being put forward by the Planning and Zoning Commission. If you would please give some background on that.
Sure. Although the previous application that was on tonight was withdrawn, that sort of was the impetus for this regulation change. It came up that we don't have a category, a land use category in our zoning regulations that addresses vehicle fueling stations. So we have, or vehicle charging stations, electric charging stations. We have fueling stations, gas fueling stations, but we had not modified the regulations to look at, or to sort of modify for the newer technology with the electric charging stations for electric cars. So when the applicant came in to do that, we had sort of made the determination that it was something that would be permitted under the intent of gasoline service stations, but we also decided to actually appropriately modify the regulation to fully address that potential use in the future. And if, as you all are aware, during part of the discussion for that previous application, part of the conversation was whether or not, you know, there are some instances where perhaps these could be, or in the past have been considered, where the charging stations have been considered somewhat accessory to the primary use, where you have sort of like somebody's going shopping, they pull in, they plug in, they charge. But it was decided that really these were more appropriate to be treated as a special permit use, considered on a case-by-case basis. So that was the idea behind the regulation, is that we would clarify that, or add this to, so that in addition to gasoline fueling stations, we now also explicitly would allow vehicle charging stations. And that would also be by special permit. So again, looked at on a case-by-case basis, so that as the technology evolves, as the demand evolves, as the trip generation associated with these evolve, we can look at the specifics of where they're proposing to be located. So even though the application for that was specific for the Walmart property was withdrawn, and they had some changes in their design directive, we still really want to encourage these, and so this will make it sort of clearer and more explicit in the regulations as to how to go about that process. The other part of this was that as I was looking to modify the regulation, which is pretty straightforward, I also sort of recalled that we haven't, it's come up in the past that we don't explicitly mention detailing facilities and car washes and oil change facilities and some of those similar, like auto-related uses. We actually have always kind of put them under this umbrella, but it doesn't actually say that in the regulation. So I thought, while we're addressing this land use category, let's also explicitly put those things into the regulation as well. The one thing, or I guess a couple things I just want to bring up. One is that, so car washes especially have always come in under this category, but it will now be explicit. Oil change facilities. Auto detailing is a little bit, can often be a little bit less intensive than some of these other uses, or a little less impactful. We could put that as like a service category, as a by right use in these zones. I still think we should keep it as a special permit under this category. You consider it on a case-by-case basis, and that way you know the details of what's being proposed. But I just wanted to put that out there as a possibility. And then the other thing, just to sort of point out, it was raised as a question by the Water and Sewer Division. What they were concerned about, especially in certain locations, like if we had a location within the watershed or something along those lines, the aquifer, that just because they're in the same category, that they wouldn't somehow, that the uses wouldn't somehow become interchangeable. So if you get approved for an electric vehicle charging station, the impacts are very different, especially from an environmental standpoint, than a gas station. So if you get approved for a charging station, it doesn't mean you can switch it out with a gas station without getting a new approval. So as you all know, and I did confirm that with the law department, so when there's a special permit approved, it's approved for exactly what's approved. Anything different has to come back. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. And then the last thing is, As you know, with regulation changes, we look to our plan of conservation and development for direction with those. And so that's why I gave you this page 7 from the 2026 Plan of Conservation and Development, or 2016 through 2026. This is the section that references sustainability, which is one of the goals identified in our Plan of Conservation and Development. And if you look at your action agenda at the end of the POCD, it actually identifies all of the categories that are considered sustainable. And I think this certainly falls within the town's general contemplation of sustainability. We define so it says Wallingford's 2016 Plan of Conservation and Development includes a variety of goals addressing the social, environmental, and economic sustainability of the community, or its ability to meet present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Topics that fall under this imperative include encouraging energy-efficient development patterns, deployment of renewable energy sources and energy conservation measures, and so on and so forth. So it sort of it talks about that as a community-based goal, pursuing community-based alternative energy projects, and so on. So I think what we're talking about here is keeping up with the technology, it's keeping up with sustainability goals. So by making it a special permit, we still look at, because I do think we'll see more electric cars over time, and I think we will see the impacts of that and the demand for those changing, and we don't really know. I mean, the applicant for the Walmart property said that they don't really know what it's going to look like. So this way, we can encourage them, but still keep up with the individual circumstances.
So really, at the end of the day, what we're looking to do is kind of looking in advance for charging stations and electric vehicles and looking to treat those from a zoning standpoint very similar to gas stations. So it gives us more discretion as far as on an application where it may be located, what's appropriate or not.
Yep.
And then as far as the others with the car washes and detailing, whatever, it somewhat clarifies our regulations and makes it more definitive.
Yeah, yep, and I think with the charging stations also, that how they're used, what they look like, you know, I mean, there's the supercharging, there's the regular charging, there are different numbers of stations, just like when you're looking at numbers of gas pumps or something like that. I think over time the charging will get faster, so it'll become, from a land use standpoint, more similar to going and, you know, whether you're charging or you're filling up with gas, they'll start to look more similar over time.
Okay. And just for my opinion, I would certainly like to have the auto detailing remain, you know, in with the car washes and oil change facilities, just simply because you never know what an auto detailing facility may look like.
Yeah.
And whatever. Commission members with questions for
Can I just add one more thing?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I forgot to add. So I was late getting our referral to South Central Regional Council of Governments, which we are required to do. So in order for them to have an opportunity to review the reg change at their meeting, I'm asking you to just have the discussion tonight and then continue to next month so we have an opportunity to get way in front of that.
Commission members with questions. Mr. Cohan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can bring it Thursday, Casey.
Okay,
if you like.
I did send it to them. They do have it.
Yeah, I'm good with the regulation, but and it's unfortunate the applicant withdrew this because really this question was for them. And I was just wondering, you know, the gas stations have, you know, the safety feature if, you know, there's a fire. I was wondering if the superchargers have any type of safety requirements that we gotta consider.
I don't know. That's a good question. So I know that they were working closely with the electric division in terms of the equipment that they provide and the, obviously how the electricity gets provided and all of that. So I can probably find out some more information from the electric division, but I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Other commission members? This is a public hearing. Are there any members of the public that would like to speak on the application? Again, as our town planner indicated, this will be continued to our next meeting. Seeing none, I guess I'd bring it back to Mrs. Hand if she has any final comments, which I doubt that she has, as well as commission members. So at this point in time, I'd entertain a motion to continue this application to our July meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we continue application 902-19 to our July meeting.
Second.
We have a second by Mr. Fitzsimmons. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Moving on, our next item is new business. It's a site plan, a 780 square foot accessory apartment for a White House at 30 West Dayton Hill Road. If the applicant would please come forward to begin preparing for his presentation. And Mr. Matarazzo, please note all correspondence for the record.
Mr. Chairman, we have an interdepartmental referral dated May 2nd, 2019, signed by the Director of Health. We have an interdepartmental referral dated May 2nd, 2019, signed by the Fire Marshal. And interdepartmental referral dated May 2nd, 2019. This is going to Eric Kruger, Senior Engineer. We have an interdepartmental referral dated May 2nd, 2019, signed by Sanitarian. We have a set of plans dated June 6, 2019.
We've always asked them to do that.
So I think we have a couple sets of plans here.
I think we know. We always know.
Looks like maybe a landscape set of plans dated June 5th, 2019. And another set of drawings dated May 31st, 2019. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Matarazzo. If the applicant would please introduce himself and begin his presentation.
Good evening. My name is Andy Whitehouse.
Sir, if you could just pull it maybe a little bit closer to you so they can pick you up.
Yeah. Good evening. My name is Andy Whitehouse, and I am proposing the in-law addition at 30 West Dayton Hill Road for my in-laws, Jerry and Nancy Harrington. It will be approximately a 780 square foot efficiency apartment with an attached garage attached by a breezeway. It will be connected to my house by approximately 13 feet, and it will also have a shared entry space between my existing garage and their new space. The exterior design will match my house, keeping a nice uniform home. Casey Hand helped me finalize a design that I believe works for the committee as well as for the layout of my home. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you guys agree.
Sure. Thank you. Mrs. Hand, do you have any comments on the application? I know you had some discussions with the applicant to, I think, bring these plans forward.
So often the requirement about keeping the apartment as sort of subordinate and integral to the primary home and what that means and what that looks like comes up, and the requirement that the apartment share a wall with the primary unit. And so if you remember, or if you noticed, their originally submitted design shared just a small doorway with the primary home, and after we talked about it a little bit further and we met with Mr. Whitehouse's architect, they found a way to modify it so that more of the wall was being shared with the house itself. The other challenge with this house is that it's built into a hill with the garage underneath. So it's a lot more difficult to make the apartment share a wall with the living space because the living space is essentially elevated. So they're converting a portion of, they're finishing a portion of the lower level into a family room and office space. And I wanted to make sure, and we had this conversation, make it clear that that really does need to become living space that actually is going to share the wall with the apartment. So that's where, again, you see in the modified plans, that's a little bit more clear. There's a little bit more sharing of the wall. The other thing is from the road, the apartment itself is behind the garage, so it should still largely maintain that look of a single family home. the applicant, Mr. Whitehouse did work with my office in trying to get us kind of as much there as we could. And this is where we kind of landed.
Sure. I just a quick question, because you mentioned there were some modifications on the plan. When I look at this plan here, where it shows the accessory apartment, it's more of a rectangle. But then when you look at the Winterbourne Land Service, the map that they gave us, you know, it's more than a rectangle.
So that 10-foot area by, there's a 15.2, that kind of,
Yeah.
that area is being added on as living space for the main house. So that will be the entryway and an office that will be an expansion. So the lower level in the back, it shows best on these plans, I think, this colored plan.
Yeah.
So the back area becomes, you have garage, then the back area becomes family room, and this becomes office.
So then on the plan that we have from Winterbourne, there should be that 12 feet 5 inches and 50, that line should be extended all the way across, is that correct?
Well, if you were, she's showing what's new. She's not dividing out what's the apartment and what's not the apartment. So the apartment is still limited, still has to be limited to that 24 by 32.5 square area.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, so if you were dividing out like primary house versus apartment, there'd be a line all the way across.
Yeah, but I say, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a wall. There's going to be a wall going across there and a door, based on this plan, correct?
Yes. Yeah, there will be a wall there.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, that was just it, because when I was looking at this, it just didn't match up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Commission members with any questions for the applicant? I guess there was, as far as there was a question, I guess, from from our Director of Public Health, as far as the well location. Mrs. Han, is that?
Yeah, so there's a form that has to be filled out. They're looking for their comments to be made conditions of approval, and there's a form that has to be filled out with them. It's called a B100A. If this application is approved tonight, and they will have to locate the well, so that can be made as a condition, and then would be addressed. And the same thing with comments from the Water and Sewer Division.
So you're all aware of that, Mr. Whitehouse, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Again, any commission members, any questions? Seeing none, any members of the public, it's not a public hearing, but we always allow people to comment on the application. Seeing none, unless you have any final questions, Mr. Whitehouse, I'll ask for a motion on your application.
Great, thank you.
Okay. At this point in time, I'd entertain a motion on the application.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve application 214-19, site plan for White House to construct a 780 square foot accessory apartment as shown on plans entitled Zoning Location Survey Map depicting existing house and proposed addition land. Andrew T. and Molly H. Whitehouse, number 30 White Dayton Hill Road, Wallingford, Connecticut, dated April 8, 2019, and in-law addition White House, final schematic design dated 27 November 2018, revised to May 31st, 2019, subject to S&E bond of $500. Comments of the Wallingford Health Department dated received May 15th, 2019 and June 7th, 2019, and comments from the Water and Sewer Division dated June 4th, 2019. And final inspection by the zoning enforcement officer.
Thank you, Mr. Benoit. We have a motion on the application. We have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Fitzsimmons. Voting beginning with Mr. Cohan, please.
Yes.
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 And yes, the application's been approved. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next item is a site plan. It's a 780 square foot accessory apartment for B. Thorpe at 10 Chimney Hill Road. Again, if the applicant would please come forward to begin preparing for his presentation. Is it correct that it appears no one's here for the applicant?
Why don't we go on to the next one and then?
Okay, we'll move down. Again, our next item is it's a receipt and action request. It's a site plan 737 square foot accessory apartment for Torello at 1501 Tuttle Avenue. Again, is the applicant here? And if you please come forward to begin preparing for their presentation. And Mr. Matarazzo, if you would please note all correspondence for the record.
Mr. Chairman, we have an interdepartmental referral dated May 24th, 2019, and I think this is the fire marshal. And we have an interdepartmental referral dated May 24th, 2019, signed by the registered sanitarian. We have interoffice memoranda, to Casey Hand, town planner, from Eric Kruger, senior engineer, dated June 3rd, 2019. We have a memorandum to James Seiter, chairman, planning and zoning, from Janice M. Small, corporate counsel, dated June 4th, 2019. We have some correspondence dated, where's the date? No date referenced here. From Casey, at that time, Costello, town planner, actually to Casey Costello, town planner, from John Ruffalo, III, RA. And we have application for site plan accessory apartment, application 216-19, dated 5/24/2019, with an attached set of plans dated May 24th, 2019. That's it.
That's it. Thank you, Mr. Matarazzo. And again, if the applicant and/or his representative would please introduce themselves and begin their presentation.
Hi.
And gentlemen, if you please just pull the mics a little bit closer to you, if you would, please. I think you're going to need to maybe raise it and make sure it's turned on to. It may not be.
How about now?
Sounds good.
My name again is Jim Torello. I am the nephew of the homeowners at 1501 Tuttle Avenue. Specifically, my uncle, he's 73 years old. He's currently in a rehab facility in Hamden because he cannot come home until his house is modified such to allow for a recent amputee to function. The house is a split-level home he's been in since the mid to late 70s. And at the end of the day, he can't function in there. He had a leg amputated a few months ago, and so that's what the genesis of this endeavor is about. We went through several different iterations of this plan that's in front of you guys now. I don't know what specific questions you guys may have for me. I'm doing this on behalf of my uncle to try to get him back into his home. I don't know what questions you guys may have for me.
Good. No, that's fine for the moment. Mrs. Hand, I know we've had some, communications, correspondence from our town attorney on it as far as, how this particular application came about and how it falls under the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. If you could please, for the commission as well as for any members of the public that are watching, give some background into that.
Sure.
And what some of those conditions are, if you would, please.
Sure. So outside of being sort of your standard application for an accessory apartment, this application does have some components that as we went through the sort of design process when this was submitted, which is also, well, I'll get into the timing in a minute, but where this is a request, as mentioned, this is a request for an accessibility need. So this is for someone that has an accessibility need under fair housing law and under ADA requirements. So essentially, there are some components of this proposal that do not comply with your zoning regulations. Specifically, what those are the side yard setback, the maximum building coverage, And as was discussed with the previous application, the requirement where the apartment share a wall with the main house. Now, what it does do here is there is a portion of the wall that there's an accessible doorway that shares with the main house, and actually the original design had the apartment bumped back further from the garage, and the applicant was willing and they were able to make it still work where the apartment could be pushed forward so that it at least did share the wall with the garage. It wasn't as separate as it previously was. Before, there was like a little breezeway connecting them, and then it was further back. So this was closer to consistent with your regulations, but there are definitely some things that don't comply, as you see in the plans. Federal law requires, fair housing law requires that you make that municipalities make what are called reasonable accommodations or reasonable modifications that are associated with an accessibility need. And Attorney Small from the law department and I have had a lot of conversation about this. We'd actually been having conversation at length about this recently anyhow. And so you have some information in your packets from her that really spell out what the requirements are. And essentially, so this is not something that would require a variance because there's not a hardship associated with it. It's not a hardship in the land. This is a separate issue where there is, in this case, a modification. So an accommodation typically would refer more to something about the layout, or a lot of times you'll hear about that with like a landlord providing an accommodation where they make the bathroom accessible or they put in a ramp or something like that. A modification is typically more related to the actual physical design requirements, so something like your zoning regulations, your zoning requirements, your setback requirements, the coverage requirements. So they're somewhat interchangeable. The requirement is still pretty much the same. So the requirement is that where there is a demonstrated accessibility need and modifications or accommodations are necessary in order to allow the person with the accessibility need to have sort of equal and fair enjoyment of their property and use of their home, that the municipality is required to provide that. So even though we don't have a regulation in place, basically we still have to provide the consideration. So when I talked to Attorney Small, we really felt that the most appropriate way to do this, it's been handled a little bit differently in the past, but we felt that the most appropriate way to do this is something that had to come before this commission anyhow because it's an accessory apartment. Fair housing law also requires that these be considered in a timely fashion. So what made the most sense was that you consider, in your consideration of the apartment, you also consider the modification. Also in your packets from Attorney Small is a suggested regulation. We don't need to talk about that tonight, but that's something that we're going to, and she and I were sort of bouncing around, should we have it be a simpler regulation with a policy, or should we put everything into the reg? But that's something sort of moving forward. We thought we should codify something, but even though we don't have something codified, you still need to make the consideration. And then in there, on page 3 to 4, so in Roman numeral 4, and then she provides several several letters of sort of when, in evaluating a request for an accommodation or modification, the following factors are to be considered. And she lists those, so whether the housing, which is the subject of the request for reasonable accommodation, will be used by an individual with disabilities, whether the requested accommodation is necessary to make housing available to an individual with disabilities protected under the fair housing laws, whether the accommodation would impose an undue financial or administrative burden on the town, whether the requested accommodation would require a fundamental alteration in the nature of the town zoning regulations. So that's really what's one of the things that are important under your considerations is if someone were requesting a modification or accommodation that was so that strongly conflicted with the intent of our zoning regulations, that would be a situation where you might not want to allow it, or you might look for someone to provide a proposal that basically didn't do that. I do not think that that's the case here. I don't think that that's an issue here. And then the last one, she states that in considering the factors referenced above, each request requires a fact-specific inquiry, and discusses with respect to the above, fundamental alteration would result in a substantial change in the nature of the zoning scheme and regulations, or a substantial impairment of the program's purpose. So basically, is the request for a modification related to the accessibility need? So what they're asking to do differently from what the regs normally allow, is that related to the accessibility need? And then does it basically harm the intent and the nature of our zoning regulations? One thing so you also have a letter from Mr. Ruffalo in there, the architect, kind of spelling out why it needed to be designed the way it was, and how that relates to the wheelchair need, wheelchair accessibility need. So for example, we had talked about, could they comply with the side yard requirements? Could they make it basically narrower and deeper? But that didn't really make sense from an accessibility standpoint, because the width of the hallways that are needed and the other accessible requirements for a wheelchair, it really needed to be more square. So things along those lines. So that's why this is sort of unusual, where you're not used to seeing requests that don't comply with your zoning regulations, but that's kind of where this is coming from. So you're considering the accommodation request as part of the accessory apartment application. You have sort of some guidelines for what you're looking at. The other thing in your recommended motion, I sort of spelled out some of that language. But the other thing that should be considered is whether the federal law does allow the commission, if you do approve an accommodation or a modification, to require that once the accessible need is no longer there, that compliance with the regulations can be required, so that anything that's non-compliant could be required to be brought back into compliance. Attorney Small also references that in her letter. And that's this removal requirement, Roman numeral 5 on page 4. And she says, so really in that case is, so you can require whatever it is to be brought back into compliance when the accessibility need is no longer there, as long as it doesn't create like an undue financial burden on someone. And she says factors to be considered include the purpose of the original requirement, the need for uniformity, the effect of allowing subsequent owners without disabilities to enjoy the lack of restrictions not afforded neighboring property owners. So again, that's something the commission might be concerned about, is that now we're going to have an apartment that doesn't comply with the regulations that in the future someone else will have that may not have a disability need. And so that's often a concern for zoning commissions. Likelihood others would seek the same, to be balanced against the cost of removal and any structural problems created by removal. So in this case, you may feel that the financial burden of requiring, the cost of requiring the removal, bringing this into compliance once it's there is too much. That may be taking things too far. So even though there may be concern about sort of having this non-compliant structure there, I think it would be, it may be unreasonable. I mean, they're not gonna, I don't think it's fair to require them to take it down afterwards or take out the kitchen afterwards, but that's kind of what you're considering here. So whatever you decide about that should also be included in your motion.
Okay. So again, just kind of to sum things up, we're required under the Fair Housing Act, we're required to consider this, and it's not appropriate that it goes to the ZBA because there's not a hardship with the land.
Correct.
And based on the law, whether or not we have procedures or regulations in place for this, we have to act upon it, on the request. And
Yeah, and it could go to ZBA. Some towns do it that way. That's what we've done in the past, except it's not a variance, it's a request. Yeah.
But I guess if you looked at a true hardship to the land, you could perhaps question whether or not there's a true hardship to the land.
Right, that would not.
So then as far as making that determination, again, as you pointed out, there's really the 4 key areas that we have to consider, and clearly I think they've indicated that the gentleman who owns the home, is the resident in the home, would like to come back and have the full use of his home, and it is because of a disability. I'm looking at the 4 points in here as far as what needs to be met, and when I'm looking at that, I certainly don't feel that there's anything in this application that would not meet the criteria. And as far as having, once the gentleman may not be occupying the home, to have the structure taken away or torn down, I think the financial burden on that would be rather substantial, and I think would be very unfair. But anyway, other commission members with any comments? Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I completely agree with your comments. I think this is a good, request that we can accommodate. But the question I do have is along your lines is, after, the current user, sells, or, how do we keep track of, what has to be done? And that's really my only question, concern.
When you say as far as what has to be done?
Well, if the accessory apartment is not in compliance and then the next owner has to do something, how do we keep track of that?
Well, I would think once we approve the accessory apartment, it's an accessory apartment and it remains as an accessory apartment. Is that correct, Mrs. Hand?
Well, so it depends. If the commission decides that it does have to be brought into full compliance afterwards, we would file something on the land records stating that. So that way, when somebody new went to buy it and there was a title search, it would show up in the title search. If you decide that that's too much of a burden and that doesn't have to happen, then we'll just state that. That should be stated in your motion, and then that way that also gets filed with the permit. So it's stated that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Benoit.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. We're pretty much, part of this is whether or not we want to approve it as a non-conforming in-law apartment once this individual is out of there and the next person in. We're basically approving it to be non-conforming.
It's basically whether you're going to allow the accommodation, the modifications, whether you're going to allow those to remain or require compliance.
Because it's non-conforming after.
Right, it'd be legal non-conforming after, yeah.
So that's basically what we have to say yes or no on.
But in this particular case, to make it compliant, it would either be completely taking it down, or perhaps reducing it in some way so the footprint matches. Whatever.
Or removing.
I think in this, that would, at least in my mind, I think that would be very impractical. But any other commission members? Yes, Mr. Allenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so that I understand as far as the non-compliance, it would be the shared wall issue, the building overall footage compared to the yard. Coverage, thank you. That was the word I was looking for. And then the setback piece. I'm looking at the map or the survey that was done, and it looks like the existing house already has a setback issue.
Yep.
And it looks like the proposed addition would not exceed what is already there. Is that correct?
Yep. And that's a really good point. So in considering these, you're really looking at them on a case-by-case basis and what the impacts are, what the potential impacts are in terms of impacts of the zoning regulations. So you have an existing garage over there that's non-conforming in terms of setbacks now. They're not making it any worse. They're staying consistent with that. So that has a lot, probably may have less impact on the overall zoning scheme than someone that was looking to go much closer, or the overall intention of the regulations, than somebody that was looking to go much closer than the existing condition. So that's a good point.
Thank you. I guess being the non-voting member tonight, my opinion really doesn't matter, but I'm going to give it anyways. But as far as coverage and the setback not being any worse and not sharing the wall, my opinion would be that, you know, if it were to be approved, that it would just carry through, that to have it set up and then come down when your uncle is no longer there, I don't think it does that much as far as to the land where it would need to come down. But like I said, that's my opinion, and I'm not voting tonight, so thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any members of the public? While this is not a public hearing, if any members of the public like to comment on the application, please come forward and name and address. Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the applicant if you gentlemen like to make any final comments before I... Mrs. Hand, any final comments from you?
Just two more. One is I should also point out, since we're talking about the specifics, the proposed apartment is also located behind the house, so we are still maintaining the look of a single-family house. It's still integral to the house, so I think that's important in this situation. And we did talk about trying to do other locations, but because, and this was explained in the letter, because of the many different levels and elevations of the house. I used to live in a house like that. It had all different ups and downs. That really made the most sense for them, and also for garage accessibility. And then I guess I would just, I don't know if you want to hear from the applicant anything further about the relationship to the accessibility design, but I do think that's all spelled out in the letter you have in the record pretty clearly.
I think that's really very clear. So at this point in time, if there's no further comments from anyone, I'd entertain a motion on the application.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve application 216-19, site plan for Torello to construct a 715 square foot accessory apartment as shown on plans entitled the Torello Residence New Accessory Apartment Addition, 1501 Tuttle Ave, Wallingford, Connecticut, 06492. Dated May 23rd, 2019, subject to S&E bond of $500. Comments of the Wallingford Health Department dated May 29th, 2019. Comments from the Water and Sewer Divisions dated June 3rd, 2019. As reasonable modification for an accessibility need in accordance with the Fair Housing and ADA law for the reasons discussed on the record tonight and described in the letter from John Ruffalo III, RA, to Casey Costello, Town Planner. The following modifications to the zoning regulation shall be allowed. A, the accessory apartment shall be allowed to share the majority of its wall with the attached garage rather than the living space of the house, with an accessory doorway between the living space and the accessory apartment. B, lot coverage shall be permitted to be 11.4% to allow an accessory single-level accessory apartment size. C, the side yard setback for the accessory apartment shall be allowed to be 24.3 feet for the addition, consistent with the existing garage setback, so that the accessory apartment layout may be more square in shape to allow for accessory space. Upon the accessibility need no longer be applicable, the structure shall not be permitted to be brought into full compliance with the regulations and shall be permitted to remain as is under the current modifications. And finally, final inspection of the zoning enforcement officer upon completion.
Do we have a motion on the application? Do we have a second? Second by Mr. Fitzsimmons. Voting beginning with Mr. Cohan, please.
Yes.
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 And yes, the application's been approved, and I guess on the commission's behalf, I certainly wish your uncle a speedy recovery.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We appreciate it.
And Mrs. Hand, do we have the representative for number 4 Thorpe in the... Okay, we'll go now to a site plan, 780 square foot accessory apartment for B. Thorpe at 100 Chimney Hill Road. Again, Mr. Matarazzo, if you'd please note all correspondence for the record, and if the applicant would please come forward to begin her presentation.
Mr. Chairman, we have an interdepartmental referral dated May 8th, 2019, signed by the registered sanitarian. We have an interdepartmental referral dated May 8th, 2019, signed by the fire marshal. We have correspondence dated May 24th, 2019. We have a health department memo to Casey Hand Town Planner from Vanessa Bautista, registered sanitarian, dated June 4th, 2019. We have an interdepartmental referral dated May 8th, 2019, signed by the senior engineer.
Thank you, Mr. Matarazzo. If the applicant would please introduce herself and please begin her presentation.
Hi, I'm Barbara.
Please just pull that a little closer to you so they can pick your voice.
Barbara Thorpe, the owner of 100 Chimney Hill Road.
Okay. And if you just give us some insight into your application, please.
It's for an accessory apartment, of which I will be living in.
That's it?
I mean, it pretty much says it all.
Okay. Mrs. Hand, I know you had some conversations with the applicant concerning the plans. Just please bring us up to date on that if you would, please.
Yeah, Ms. Thorpe had previously submitted an application, and it wasn't really, again, that sort of question of having it be integral to the main house and subordinate to the main house had come up. So she withdrew her application and resubmitted a modified design to try to address some of those concerns a little bit more. And I think she's done a nice job of sort of incorporating that, or her architect has done a nice job of sort of incorporating that, where now we have sort of the garage pushed forward with the apartment kind of behind it. So other than that, I don't have any comments.
Just there was one comment from our registered sanitarian concerning
yes.
just soil testing.
Yes.
Has that been done, or?
There is that comment, but then there was a second comment that, let's see, this from June 4th. So there was 4A, but that's superseded by 4D, where
Just telling me there's not an issue?
Yeah, it's not an issue.
So it's not, so that's been addressed?
Yeah, so the requirements, so she does not have to do, so basically the septic doesn't have to be increased. She still has to do the B100A form, but everything else is addressed.
So at the end of the day,
You can make that a condition of approval.
What is the B100A form?
It's the form for the health department. So you just do that.
That was resolved.
Yeah, so once you get your, assuming you get your approval tonight, before you get your building permit, there's just a form you have to fill out with that.
Okay.
Okay? But everything else is good.
Okay, thanks, Casey.
thank you, Mrs. Hand. That's a B100A.
B100A. You have to do it any time you're doing a building
We
addition.
just want to make sure we have it for the motion. Thank you. Any commission members with questions for the applicant? Seeing none, any members of the public that would like to make any comment on the application? You two gentlemen seem to be very interested. At this point in time, I'd entertain a motion on the application.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve application 215-19, site plan for Thorpe to construct a 780 square foot accessory apartment as shown on plans entitled Project Client Thorpe, 100 Chimney Hill Road, Wallingford, Connecticut, dated April 22nd, 2019, revised to May 2nd, 2019, subject to S&E bond of $500. Comments of the Wallingford Health Department dated received May 15, 2019, and June 7, 2019. Completion of a B100A form. Comments from the Water and Sewer Divisions dated June 4th, 2019, and final inspection from Zoning Enforcement Officer upon completion.
We have a motion on the application. Do we have a second? Second by Mr. Fitzsimmons. Voting beginning with Mr. Cohan, please.
Yes.
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 And yes, the application has been approved. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mrs. Hand, now if you would please take us through the rest of the agenda, if you would.
Sure. Okay. 1163 South Broad. It's ready for release for me, but I don't have a response from engineering yet, so I don't. You want to wait till next month?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Administrative approvals, I will leave to you. There were several of them. I will leave to you for questions.
Anyone any questions on administrative approval?
Okay. I will point out that 2 of them are utilizing our new town center zoning regulation, which is exciting. So we are seeing little bits of movement there. Okay, ZBA decisions from May 20th. 2 were approved. There was a denial for the property at 188 Parker Farms Road. There was a previously approved set of variances for those, and now they were looking to go further, so that did get denied. Choate was approved for its lighting for the new field. Coming up this month with ZBA, number 9, there are several variances. I guess the ones that I would point out would be item number 3, which is 28 Parker Street, is Protronics Investment Properties. It's the property right next to the railroad. It's like on the Route 5 side of the railroad on Parker Street. Yep. It's pretty tight in there, and they do have trucks back onto that property from the road because it's tight. So if the variance does get approved, that will be coming to you for site plan approval. So I've talked to them about landscaping requirements and loading requirements. So that is something that we'll have to address if it makes its way to you guys. And then, let me see. I think there was one. Oh, the other one I would point out to you is item number 7, also in that neighborhood, the Parker Place, the new apartments that are being built, the big expansion over there, which is coming along very nicely, I think. So there's frontage on 3 sides of that property, and what I would consider the back side, but is still frontage. So you have Parker Street, Washington Street, and then I can't remember what the 3rd street is, but that street is where the dumpster is currently located, essentially. And they built a very nice dumpster enclosure in that area, but they're going to, they need to do a compactor instead of a dumpster because of the number of apartments, and it was going to involve too much dumpster-wise. And the way the compactor, that they're proposing the compactor to be basically within that area of the dumpster, it'll extend into that little front yard area a little bit, so they need a variance for that.
But that's all going to be screened and
it's going to be screened. It's very nicely screened right now, and it's not, I mean, it's really not really visible from any, there is one property across the road there, but it's as, I think as close to being, there's really no side there that it's not visible. So I think that's probably the best spot we could kind of get. So,
but again, it's going to be appropriately screened, and
yeah, and I can make sure of that.
I mean, it's a very, as you mentioned, it's a very attractive project the way it's going. So
yeah,
I would think that they would want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
How about number 2, Mrs. Hand?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I should have brought that one up. Okay, so this is the property where there is a Wendy's there, and then there are 2 other like small restaurants on the property. It's all one property, so Wendy's and the 2 buildings to the north of it. That's all one property. What the applicant here is looking to do is to split off the Wendy's piece and the rest of the property. And what ends up they're not actually looking to reduce the amount of open space that's there. It's just that the way the property, it's already non-conforming, and so the properties would be conforming in terms of size still and frontage. But because we're looking to create a new property, even though they're not asking to reduce the green space that's existing, and actually I expect, so essentially the Wendy's piece would end up with, when you draw the line, even if you don't change any of the green space, it doesn't meet the minimum green space requirement. So that's why they're looking for the variance. Now, the vacant piece will be coming, I expect, will be coming to you with an application.
For a parking lot?
For a parking lot, for vehicle storage.
I thought so.
So at that point, they understand that there are landscaping requirements and all of those types of requirements that would apply.
Okay. Commissioners, with any questions, any comments on any of the variance applications? If you would please continue, Mrs. Hand.
Yes. So before we do zoning enforcement log, I just wanted to mention to you that you do have in your packets, we did not have a lot of receipts. It's been a quiet, application-wise at least, it's been a quiet 2 months, this month and next month. But I did include in your packets an application for the electronic sign regulation. So in there, as proposed, it would be a prohibition on digital signs, a definition of digital signs, and then a prohibition on them. So under your prohibited signs, there is one exemption that, or exception, I should say, that I'm proposing, and I did talk to Attorney Small about this at length as well, which is that for gas stations, there would be proposed, as proposed, there is a limited amount of digital signage that would potentially be permitted. So you can consider that. And the idea would be that that would be able to be used for the pricing signs.
Of gasoline.
We cannot require that it be used for the pricing signs because it's to be tied to the land use. We can't dictate content. But the way that it's written, I think that's how it would most likely end up being
I'm going to say,
used.
how can we encourage that? I mean, if we're going to allow it, so it seems like we would want to have something in there so it really is encouraged.
Right, so it allows for as proposed, it allows for up to 3 digital signs that are of a certain size. So I think it's unlikely, given the proposed size, that you would use them for much else, but you should be aware that we can't dictate content, so someone could choose to use them differently. I would also point out, because and we can talk about this as part of the public hearing, we will talk about it as part of the public hearing, but for your sort of consideration with this draft regulation, I just want to, I guess, sort of make sure you consider this moving forward. There's not a requirement that pricing signs be provided at gas stations. They do have to provide them on pump toppers, like the pump toppers. They don't have to provide a big, so I did learn that recently, but.
But in all likelihood, a gas station is going to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So that's what's on for next month.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then finally, we have our zoning enforcement log. There is one thing that I think did not make it onto here because it happened at the end of last week, which is up in Yalesville, one of the properties up there. I got called, and up on Old Colony Road, north of Atwater Place, a few properties north of Atwater Place. I got a call about fill being brought in, and went out there and discovered quite an issue with junk cars. So it's been bought by the owner of a dealer and repairer in town, and so it was a pretty big deal. And I did call some of the entities at the state, and I also had some conversation with the property owner. To their credit, I will say they worked very, very hard. I was out there today. Almost all of the cars are gone. They do have a cease and desist because we can, when there's fill involved, we can immediately cease and desist. They're also under a under an order from the Wetlands Commission because there are some wetlands issues involved. That will show up in some form next month.
Thank you. Any commission members questions on zoning enforcement log? Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick things. I looked through this and I noticed Walmart was on here, and we had the manager of Walmart a couple months ago, and he was very accommodating. He said, if there's any issues, give me a call, and we have his business card. I don't know if that camper is still out there, but they're still on the log. And then just wanted, since we have a change in the Public Works Director, I was wondering if we could get a status or see what's going on at the cemetery and let Mr. Baltramitis know he's got an outstanding issue.
Yep.
That is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Any other? At this point in time, if there's no other business, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we close Planning and Zoning meeting of June.
We have a motion to close our meeting. Do we have a second? Second by Mr. Fitzsimmons. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, abstentions? Meeting's adjourned. Have a good evening.